Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dames Ablaze. If you haven't watched the intro video yet, can I suggest you go do that now so you know what we're up to? Otherwise, grab your Bible. We're going to dig on in. We're looking today at chapter 4 of John, looking at verses 46 to 50. I'll read them to you now. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judah into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. And Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." The nobleman said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your son lives." So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. You know how I said last week that the timing of things was a bit tricky? Well, I think there's a possibility that I've managed to make sense of some of the discrepancies. If we take a look at Luke's coverage of the Nazarene incident, which is in Luke 4, we might be able to work some of this out. I'm just going to paraphrase it. But Jesus heads into Galilee. He goes through Nazareth, arriving on a Saturday, is rejected. Actually, that's a bit tame for what happened. They tried to push him off a cliff after he'd not so subtly pointed out that both Elijah and Elisha had helped Gentiles instead of Jews. So as I said, they tried to push him off a cliff. There's an interesting little byplay here that we completely miss because we're not conversant with the traditions of the Jews of the time. It's got nothing to do with today's lesson, but I'm going to tell you anyway. On the Day of Atonement, Moses' law said the two goats were chosen. One was to be the sacrifice, the other was the scapegoat, right? The sin goat was killed for their sins. The scapegoat carried the guilt for their sins out of the camp and into the wilderness, right? However, a later tradition had sprung up by which the people actually followed the goat to make sure it didn't bring the guilt back into the camp. They pushed it off a cliff. Do you notice the correlation? It's nothing to do with today's lesson, as I said, but I thought it was kind of cool. Anyhow, Nazareth rejects him. He does exactly what he will tell the disciples to do. He shakes the dust from his feet. He carries on to Cana, where he is then greeted by a nobleman. After spending a short time in Cana, he moves to Capernaum, where Luke picks the story up again. This timeline seems to make sense to me. In effect, John is filling in a gap in Luke's narrative and showing you how Jesus deals with towns that reject him. It's a good reminder to us that we're not to take the reception of the message to heart. People will either accept or reject the message of Jesus. It's not our job to worry about that. Our job is simply to present the case for Christ in as winsome a way as possible. So let's get to our text then. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. John wants to make very clear that we are in the right place. Jesus has returned to Cana, the site of his first sign, the first being done at a happy occasion, a wedding, a directly opposing kind of affair than the one that will confront him on this trip to Cana. No sooner is he in town when a nobleman turns up. Now that word sometimes is translated a royal official, a government official, a servant of a certain king, a certain ruler, official, certain attendant, and even courtier. Which should tell you that we're not entirely sure what sort of title this guy is supposed to have. The Greek word means royal. The other 4 times it's used in the scriptures is in Acts twice, both times referring to Herod and therefore definitely meaning royal. James uses it once and it's referring to the law as being royal, and then the other time is here in John, referring to the same individual. So it seems more likely that this nobleman was in fact a royal rather than just an attendant on a royal, which would make him most likely a relative of Herod. Now this flies in the face of the theory that this is Chusa, referred to in the book of Luke as a manager of Herod's household, whose wife Joanna was at the cross. Whether or not he's a royal or merely an attendant on a royal is possibly immaterial, because I think the reason John tells you this is merely to point out that this is a person with clout, a person with influence, means, not someone you want to trifle with. He comes from Capernaum, which is 26 kilometres away as the bird flies. Travelling on a modern road is 38 kilometres, but we have no way of determining how far the road was in Jesus' days, so possibly somewhere between the two. Let's make it 30 k's to make our calculation a little easier. According to Google, the average walking speed of a human being is 5 k's an hour. That's 6-hour walk, give or take. That's, of course, if he walked. If the guy was a noble, I'd be surprised if he was walking. He would have been in a tearing hurry, seeing as his child is so sick. Royals have access to horses in those days. Even if he was an official rather than a royal himself, he'd still likely have access to a faster mode of travel than just beating the feet. Which is why I'm not going to camp here and make a big deal of the size of the journey. I don't know if it took the man 6 hours to get there or not. Might have been longer, might have been shorter. Point isn't how long the guy took to get there. The point is he was determined to get to Jesus and take him home to heal his son. The man is desperate and obviously seeking a miracle. No other reason would drag a parent away from a child when they're on their deathbed. Word of Jesus coming out of Judea into Galilee has reached this man's ears. Jesus has now come close enough to take a chance on getting to him before the boy dies, and he is determined above all things to secure his son's healing. We're not told the exact cause of the child's sickness. The Greek word just means weak or feeble, to be ill without strength or to languish. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? I'd be beside myself if my child were in this state. So he comes to Jesus and implores him to come down and heal his son. Implore in our language basically means to beg, but in ancient Greek it means to make an earnest request. You can feel the man's desperation, can't you? And you can understand it when John clarifies that the boy was near death. He's left the dying bedside of his son to secure the healer that Galilee is all abuzz with. And what does Jesus say? Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. Sounds a bit ticked off, doesn't he? Was the man asking for a sign or a wonder? Not really. He earnestly asked for a healing for his son. Clearly, Jesus knows something about the sickness that we don't know. But why does he challenge the man like this? Actually, it's a bit of a pattern that Jesus has with parents. when Jesus comes down the mountain after being transfigured in front of the disciples, you see a father comes to him and complains that his disciples haven't been able to take the demon out of his son, and he says, Jesus asks him to, have some belief, and so he does. In Mark 7, Jesus and the crew are outside of Jerusalem. They're actually in Tyre and Sidon. Where am I? Mark 7. I'm just going to read from 24 to 29. He arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." So it seems that Jesus was often challenging parents when they came on behalf of their children. Why is that, do you think? So some say it's a test to force the parent to press in to see where their faith is. And I do believe that's true, but I wonder if there's a subtlety that we're missing. Is Jesus checking where their faith is for their children or themselves? "I believe, help my unbelief," is the cry of a father's heart. "Sir, come down, else my child lives, and even I'll take the crumbs that fall from the table. Just do something, Jesus." Where is our faith when we think about our children? Do we have faith that God will care for them the way we do? Or do we feel that he's not eager enough to come and help? I have to say, when I was writing this one, my kids were going through some stuff, so it was an interesting time to be reading this. Both my kids went through the fire, and my faith in God regarding them and their well-being has certainly wavered at that point. I wanted him to save them, and instead they fell hard. So then the question was, do I trust God to know what he's doing? Because during that stage, it looked like he'd lost the plot. But I knew he hadn't, right? And looking back, I can say, no, he certainly knew what he was doing. But at the time, yeah, not so much. I know he loves them more than I, right? I know that ultimately they are his kids. I just get to borrow them, and so I have to trust that he is doing a work in them and through them that will be for their good. I have to cry with that father, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." It's a humbling point to get to, though, isn't it? That nobleman came to an unknown man, a carpenter's son, to have his son healed. There is a level of faith in even coming to see Jesus. There is a level of faith in the desire for him to return to Capernaum with him. But is it the kind of faith that God is looking for? Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you won't believe. The word people is plural, so this isn't just an indictment on the nobleman. There are others standing around, seated perhaps, watching, listening, wanting something. Seeing is believing, or so they say, but is it really faith if you see something? Thomas wanted to see, didn't he? Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe, said old doubting Thomas. It was faith of sorts, but not the best kind of faith. Jesus himself said it was okay to have this kind of faith, but 8 days later, when he gives Thomas that opportunity to put his finger into the wounds, he admonishes him, do not be unbelieving rather, but believing. Thomas, of course, yells out that he does believe, and this is Jesus' reply. Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We have a need to see, to touch, to feel, to have tangible proof, or at least some evidence that we can use to prop up our faith. And we do get that, but it's often after the act of belief. God requires our belief. That is our reasonable sacrifice. It seems such a simple thing, and yet in the hardest of times, when the children are in trouble, when they are sick and at death's door, it is the hardest thing of all. These Jews who believed in Jesus believed not because of his words, as the Samaritans had done, but because of his actions, the signs and wonders. I don't wonder that Jesus found the incessant need for signs to be a little wearying. I don't know how Jesus says this, like you don't know what tone he used. I wish we knew what tone they used. It would go a long way to settling debates. Some think he's being harsh, some think he's disappointed. I kind of imagine him shaking his head sadly, as we would when dealing with our children, when they have once again done something really stupid or shown themselves to still need to mature in some area. And that's it really, isn't it? It's about maturity. People start attending church for all sorts of reasons, for healing, for power, to get help, because mum and dad used to go. They go to God for what he can do, not who he is, and I think it wearies him. What is it that Jesus is indicting them with? The need for a sign. Well, a sign would be usually miraculous and given with the express purpose of confirming or authenticating something. In Jesus' case, it was to show who he was. The need for a sign and a wonder. So our wonders are miraculous, and they are done specifically to produce a reaction in those looking on. It's a moment of heaven breaking through and showing itself like a beam of sunlight on a cloudy day. And you would think that would make a big difference in the way people accept God. But consider for a moment the Israelites as they come out of Egypt and travelled through to the promised land. Sign after sign after sign, wonder after wonder after wonder, and yet they get to the edge of the promised land and don't dare go in because of the giants. All those signs, all those wonders, and they still didn't trust God. You know, if you're feeling a little untrusting of God, it might be a good idea to remind yourself of all that he has already done, which doesn't always mean the worst thing can't or won't happen. It can certainly always do that. But a steady, strong belief in God will see that even if the worst things happen, it can only be for the betterment of all involved. And if you will trust, even when you're in the pit, that God has a plan, you will see his goodness in the land of the living. Mankind has had plenty of signs and wonders. But we're still building golden calves and worshipping the created things instead of the one who created them. No wonder Jesus shakes his head sadly and indicts mankind with our need for signs and wonders. The Father appears to take absolutely no interest in Jesus' words, but urges him all the more to come down before my child dies. Naaman the Syrian had similar thinking. You remember that Naaman had leprosy and went to Israel to be cured by the prophet. But he went away kind of angry because the prophet didn't cure him. You know, well, not the way he thought it should happen. He thought he should go to any river and be cured, and Elijah said, no, go to the Jordan. We're very good at coming up with ways God can help, aren't we? I mean, our prayers sometimes can be full of, you could do this or that. It's awfully difficult to simply pray, "Thy will be done." We want so much from the Lord that our prayers can often overflow with petition rather than praise and fellowship. It's a challenge to all of us, myself included, to come to the Lord for fellowship from time to time instead of just petition. There is a lot made of the fact that the Father insists Jesus has to come to the Son. The scholars accuse the nobleman of having weak faith on the basis of it, but I'd like to redeem him a little. Jesus hasn't actually done anything from a distance yet. It's not something that they have experienced. I mean, when a rabbi was going to bless an ailing individual, they laid hands on them. The people have yet to see Jesus do anything different, so why on earth would he be expecting anything different? As soon as Jesus tells them that his son is well, he goes. There's no more argument and no need of proof, so I don't know that the harsh words spoken against the faith of this man are quite justified. Jesus tells him to go on your way, your son lives. It's all the proof he needs. Therein lies his faith, and the reason I don't believe we should give him a hard time for wanting Jesus to come. It was, I think, natural to want the rabbi to come to the boy. There is nothing lacking in his faith when Jesus tells him he's no longer dying, is there? He doesn't hesitate, he just goes on his way trusting the word of the Lord. In many ways, this nobleman is the same as the Samaritans. He believes in Jesus' words and acts upon them without seeing any proof at all. I think he had greater faith than modern scholars give him credit for. Having faith in God is having trust in him, believing that if he has said it will come to pass, it will come to pass. We shouldn't need to have chapter and verse about how it will come to pass, or even when. We should trust in the one who is and has proven himself to be trustworthy. It's not the same as wishing things will come to pass. Wishes are nothing more than dandelion seeds floating on the wind. Faith digs into the Lord, reminds him of his promises, and expects a result. Hebrews 11, the great chapter of faith, starts with these words. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The nobleman had faith in Jesus' words and acted accordingly. Remember what we talked about a few weeks back. He who received Jesus' testimony has certified or set his seal upon the fact that God is true. By believing in the words of Jesus, this man has set his seal upon the fact that God is true. His faith is shown in the fact that he returns to his home without further discussion. He actually didn't need a sign or wonder. All he needed was Jesus' assurance, and he left. John's covered 6 different types of faith in this section of Scripture. From Nicodemus's questioning and confused faith to the nobleman who believed without seeing, we've had a bit of a taste of every kind of faith. There's a good little overview of humanity. Those that go away still wondering, those that are totally convinced, and those that reject. The Nazarenes rejected out of their prejudices and their own preconceived ideas of who Jesus was. That's a big one today. Lots of people have preconceived ideas of Jesus, and it's a serious stumbling block to even hearing the gospel, let alone accepting it. When we meet that kind of person, we must first understand the nature of the stumbling block. What is it that they do believe about Jesus or God? If you start with their stumbling block, you might have more luck destroying it. Having hope is not the same as having faith. We can hope that God can change the outcome, or we can trust and have faith in his will being done. Asking Jesus to perform a miracle only requires hope. Watching him perform one would give you knowledge, but walking away without proof of anything, having nothing but his word, that takes faith. We can feel often that God isn't listening, or not close, but if we will walk away as this man does with nothing but the promise, if we can believe that it may not happen overnight but it will happen, that we can trust to God's timing, which is so very different to our own. If we can do these things, then we have trusted in the word of God and therefore declared him to be true. Let's not indict this man with lack of faith because he wanted Jesus to come with him. He's in very good company. In fact, he's the same as all of us. So he goes, and Jesus doesn't go with him. And the question needs to be asked, why not? Why didn't Jesus want to go with the man? He went with Jairus. He went to the grave of Lazarus. He went over the Sea of Galilee to meet with a naked demoniac running around the tombs of Gadarene. Why didn't he go with this guy? Actually, none of the scholars even looked at this question, so perhaps we shall be the first. Here's what I think. If we grant that this man has some connection to the household of Herod, either through blood or through vocation. That means that whatever Jesus does for this man will come to the ears of Herod. Now, how would that work going forward to the trial? If Herod had some pre-knowledge of Jesus that included seeing a downright straight miracle, not just hearing about it, but seeing it, how do you think that might have changed the outcome of Jesus' trial? There's always more at play in the background of our Bibles than we know about, because the gospel writers weren't interested in those things. But Jesus' life didn't happen in a vacuum. Everything he did was choreographed down to the finest detail. It shouldn't surprise us then that he would want to avoid being around Herod until the appropriate time. That's my theory. I think it makes sense of Jesus' reluctance to go with this nobleman. Clearly he was willing to heal, because he does. He obviously has no problem with Capernaum as such, because he ends up having his home base there, but going with this man wasn't on the cards at that time, and so he heals from a distance in what John will call the second sign. I was thinking about that. If a sign is about confirming or authenticating something, then we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is this sign confirming? What exactly does this healing denote? What is it a sign of? Remember that John's whole purpose is to show Jesus as divine. What specific aspect of God does this scream of? Omnipresence, right? If Jesus can heal from a distance, that means he's omnipresent. There's only one being that has that aspect, and that would be God. Do you see why John calls it a sign? Signs and wonders. Men still seek them. Women still crave them. What of us? Do we need a sign? Or are we content to believe on the word of God and sing, "It is well with my soul," regardless of what's going on in our daily lives? That is all I have for you this week. I know it was a bit of a challenge there at the end. I pray you'll rise to the challenge. I pray a blessing on your household and yourselves. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Before I leave, can I just remind you that if you have not subscribed yet, to do so, to click on the bell icon down the bottom there so that you get notification, and if you could throw a like if you did like it, that would be awesome. Other than that, have a fantastic week. I will see you next week. Ka kite.